All right, welcome back, everybody. We come to our last content of this 2 days digital conference. We continue with the panel discussion on integrating different perspectives on integrity issues in parasport, and therefore the stage is with Andy Hayes, who will introduce the panel.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Absolute pleasure to be here. So a little bit of a brief sort of synopsis of the panel discussion today. So through the Respect P focus groups, the work package that we ran, the Clean Sport Alliance seeks to raise the voice of para-athletes across Europe through an exploration of what clean sport means to para-athletes. So hearing the voice of athletes in this way is absolutely vital to ensure that research and practice work to support the very community that wishes to compete in a clean sport environment. The panel discussion brings together two Paralympic athletes involved with this research as athlete researchers, as well as an anti-doping consultant experienced in work with para-athletes and an academic with considerable experience with researching doping, including work in parasport. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome, to begin with, Professor Cornelia Blank, Professor and Deputy Head of the Institute of Sports Medicine, Alpine Medicine and Health Tourism at UMIT Tirol. Juliana Soares, anti-doping consultant with over 10 years of experience delivering anti-doping education, including considerable work in parasport. Lena Gabrscek, the Slovenian Paralympic sitting volleyball player from 2012 in London and motivational speaker. And Dr. Patrick O'Leary, Irish Olympic canoeist at the 2016 Games and the 2022 Games, and a registrar at the National University of Ireland. So I'd like everyone to welcome our panelists today. Yeah, it should be a really interesting discussion that I'm hoping will keep quite light, considering it's the last session of the 2-day program. So we have another number of questions based around the themes that have come out of the focus group research, but and there's also some more general questions around integrity issues in parasport and in general. And we've already seen today from today and the previous day yesterday that there's integrity in sport is quite a big area. So to keep things sort of light to begin with and to warm up, what I'd really like to start with is just to go around the panel members to sort of give us an idea and a flavour of what brings you to this field, what brings you into the field of clean sport, anti-doping, integrity, be it in a research capacity, a consultancy capacity, or engagement as an athlete researcher. So why you're interested in clean sport integrity and why is it an important topic? I'm going to go to Pat first.
Thanks, Andrew. I suppose this kind of comes back to a lot of the stuff. I suppose I was involved in the Respect project and then Respect P, and we talked about this a little bit at the Respect project. This goes right back to my youth. I suppose my parents were a very big influence in terms of ethics and in terms of a moral code and the way of doing things. My father was a lawyer and ultimately a judge. And so I was always involved in sport, but I was always also very conscious of the ethical contract that I had as an athlete, that I agreed to a set of rules. Everyone else agrees to that set of rules, and we compete on that basis. And that's always been the way I've approached it. I suppose the other side of it is that, like, professionally for nearly 20 years, I was a lecturer in chemistry in now University of Galway. And I had interest in biologically active molecules as well and analytical chemistry. So there's an interest from there. And then I suppose when I got back into, when I acquired my disability and became a para-athlete, I got back into it in terms of being tested. So there's loads of things, and I think that's true for a lot of people. There's loads of things that lead you to where you end up in this space.
Thank you for that, Pat, and thank you for continuing on from Respect into Respect P. You're a fantastic asset to the team here. Juliana, to turn to you, what interests you about working as a consultant and with so much experience?
I believe that you have more experience than me. Thanks. We have so many topics to talk about. This is amazing panel that we have the opportunity to discuss about so many topics, but the misrepresentation for us, it's a very tricky topic, especially for blind athletes, but also the education for them. And we cannot forget the intellectual disability. It's also a very complicated topic subject for how we can educate our athletes about anti-doping. So I had the opportunity to listen from our guys, and we are creating new strategies, tools to develop all these informations. But we are here for discuss, and anyone has a new idea, we are open.
Thank you for that, Juliana. And you touched on misrepresentation already there. Listening to Andrea's discussion prior to this, she obviously touched upon the fact that classification, I think she described it as derailing the discussion in terms of doping. So absolutely, it stands quite tall in terms of the integrity issues that are important in parasport. Lena, turning to you now, in terms of your involvement in Respect P, sort of, you came into this as an athlete researcher and ran the focus groups in Slovenia. Sort of what interests you about this topic?
Well, I've been part of parasports for more than 15 years now, and it really changed my life because through parasport, I really got better self-esteem, and I feel more confident about myself now. And as you mentioned, I'm also giving some motivational speeches, mostly for kids. And being a clean athlete, I think it's the most important thing if you want to be a role model. So yeah, when my National Anti-Doping Agency invited me, I was more than glad to join, since I'm also an anti-doping ambassador here, and I think it's an important topic to talk about.
Thank you for that, Lena. And I've got a few questions towards the end in terms of how it's sort of the experiences that you've had in terms of anti-doping ambassadors and this research, how that's influenced you in terms of motivational speaking and working with athletes. Cornelia, finally to you. Appreciate you've done a fair amount of work in this space. Sort of what got you into here?
Hi everyone. I actually came to the topic from a rather practical side, being involved in the implementation of the anti-doping things at the Youth Olympic Games 2012 in Innsbruck. So at that time, I really thought of, is that really true that 14 to 19-year-old athletes would even be involved in doping cases? And I just was interested in why and who's surrounding them. So I was at the same time doing my master's in health sciences, and that's why I was my master's thesis, taking into the topic and asking myself what could be the reason for young athletes to dope. And as I'm more into the health promotion aspect of health science, I actually also ask myself, why do they not dope at that moment? So that's how I got to the topic, and it developed then over the last, I'd say now 10 years into a broad piece of stakeholders, including young athletes, their trainers, their coaches, medical staff, and then in the end now also para-athletes. So that's how I got to the topic.
Thank you, Cornelia. And like Patrick said, everyone comes at there with their own different story. Yeah, it's just really nice to get an idea of how we've arrived here, and then get into those discussions that Juliana's already mentioned in terms of some quite meaty topics to begin with. So we've got two of the athlete moderators, the athlete researchers on this panel today. So I think it would be great to start with their experiences from conducting the focus group, because that's really what this panel discussion comes through, and then the different perspectives. Lena, what do you think were the key sort of findings and the key learnings from you conducting those focus groups? What stood out to you?
Yeah, I think that all of the athletes that were part of our focus group, and they are all Paralympian, because we included those who went to Tokyo Paralympic Games. They all mentioned this misrepresentation thing because it's a really big thing in all the sports. I think I come from sitting volleyball, and I think that the system there is quite fair now. It wasn't as fair as it's today, because the rules weren't so strict before. So yeah, we mainly discussed this and we didn't find the solution. To be honest, I do agree that it's a really wide topic and that the classifiers also have tough work to do, because it's hard to compare different disabilities. And so yeah, that was the main thing that we discussed in our focus group.
I think that feeling of the difficult job that classifiers have came through in all of the European focus groups, in terms of it's almost an impossible job being a volunteer, and the challenges they face with the flaws in the system. Turning to you, Pat, in terms of your experience, you're now not an experienced campaigner in terms of the Respect projects, now Respect P, but also on panel discussions. I was just wondering, from your work through the Respect projects, have you noticed anything different between what was spoken about in the Respect project compared to the Respect P? Were the conversations different noticeably?
I think probably the biggest difference was that the athletes in the Respect P project weren't as homogeneous, and in terms of their opinions and in terms of where they went to or what they got engaged with. So some athletes were engaged with anti-doping. Virtually all athletes were engaged with misrepresentation. And I think it probably does reflect, like, I suppose I come from a situation where my disability is smack bang in the middle of a classification. There's no question. I walk in, I take off my limb, and everyone goes, well, you're a KL3 and a VL3 and you can go out, you know, no question. But I suppose I had been around athletes all the way through, and I know the difficulties that are there and the uncertainty that's there. And I suppose that probably the biggest thing that came out of it for me was, it's not necessarily that athletes think that the classifiers are doing a bad job, or that there's any corruption or ill will or anything like that. It's just, I think athletes would like it to be clearer and to be more open. And that does require a little bit of openness on us as athletes, being willing for our story to be told and our story to be shared. So like you can always pick somebody out who is on the borderline, and why are they on one side or the other? There is a reason behind it, but very often the other athletes that surround that person don't know that. And it probably needs a little bit more ability to communicate. And you know, you're getting into a very difficult situation in classification because it talks about people's medical records. Whereas in doping, it's about, you know, did they have it in the system or didn't they have it in the system? You know, and then once you get that they did have it in the system, is there a reason, or is there an excuse, or is there a mitigating factor? But it's not a medical record issue. So that's the difficulty. And I think people appreciate that, but they would really value a solution to that.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's really interesting in terms of that clear and more open, but then the complexities of classification. And I suppose that's already looming large over our conversation today. So I suppose turning to Juliana and Cornelia, do you feel like the complexity of parasport means that it's more open to these integrity concerns than non-parasport?
I can go first. I don't think it makes it more open, but I think the perception of athletes might be that it is. And I think that is a clear task for us in anti-doping and then also in integrity issues, to communicate to them that we try everything we can not to make it more open for fraud in any kind of integrity area. So I think both areas are open for misconduct, non-para and parasport. But I think, and that's what we heard from our interviews back in 2020, that a lot of athletes perceive it as to be more open for misconduct, because there are so many complexity issues with TOEs and also with the classification issue, which is not even doping, but an integrity issue for them as well.
I completely agree with Cornelia. And I'm from South America, so I have a different perspective of you. And here we just don't have the problem with understand what's all the issues, but also they don't have knowledge about what misrepresentation or even about anti-doping integrity. It's really, we have a lack of understanding what's integrity for so many reasons. So we need to understand that, especially my perspective, it's completely different. And here we need to treat our athletes and how we are going to explain them how to proceed during the doping control or even a classification process. All athletes going to pass through classification, but not all of them going to pass through anti-doping, if you think that it's a national or regional level of athletes. So we need to start to teach our teachers to explain them, and after you'll be a process. It's my point of view, sorry.
No, it's, and obviously the Respect and Respect P projects emerged from the Erasmus Plus program, and therefore very European centric as well. So I suppose coming back to you, Juliana, how do you best extend the research, the reach of this research to become more geographically rich? Sorry, it's a hopefully my answer. How do the research that's been conducted through Respect and Respect P has been very European centric, and that's obviously to do with the funding in terms of how do we seek to broaden that to be more geographically rich?
I've answered the questions for Respect, the questionnaire, and for sure I've tried to give as much as possible European site, but it's the first project, so we can try to reply the same one in different countries and different regions, but it's not the same way. I believe that we can make agreements with international federations to try to make different questionnaires and also approach, because it's, I'm sending the questionnaire for Ali about boosting its representation, and so many athletes from especially South America are not able even then answer about it. So we need to maybe get back some steps behind to try to balance this. And I think that it will be the same for Africa and some countries for Asia. So for get more easily to answer some questions about this topic. And this way, I believe that we can have a more global answer, not just the European one.
Yeah, I know Ali's pushing hard for that, so fingers crossed it continues. So I suppose to turn to the subject that derailed the doping conversation, as Andrea mentioned, classification. So well, I suppose the major aspect for me that came out of the focus groups was that not just that integrity concerns in clean sport, it wasn't just anti-doping, it wasn't just the use of performance enhancing substances. Often the conversation went straight to classification, and the potential flaws, and obviously the openness for the misrepresentation and people exploiting systems in that way. I suppose a question to all of the panel, whoever wants to jump in first, do we feel like that is the main integrity issue in parasport above doping?
I think it is. I think it's the one of most concern. Whether it's the biggest problem is another thing. But I think that the point that Juliana said earlier on is relevant, in that every para-athlete goes through classification, most of them multiple times. So everybody goes through it, and everybody knows that everybody else has gone through it. When you're talking about anti-doping, not everybody does it, because it depends on your level. And even if somebody is at a sufficient level, it depends on the country and the resources of the country and the standard of the athlete and all of that. So you're not sure whether someone just has never been tested or they're being tested regularly. And we kind of accept that as there's an element of inevitability in that. But we know everybody is being held to a standard in classification. So if there's any concern about that, it's a concern for everybody that's in there. So I think that's kind of one of the reasons it rises to the top, not necessarily, well, I also think it's very sports centric. There was a huge difference in responses depending on the sport and the number of classifications that existed within a sport. So if you have a sport with 8 or 10 classifications and somebody's on a fine line, whether they go up or down, it's not going to affect that many people. But if you have a sport with only 2 or 3 classifications, if somebody goes up or down, it makes a huge difference. So I think that I'm not sure whether if you were just to count incidents of cheating, whether it's more often, but it certainly is of greater concern to the athletes.
Sorry, I just pop up an idea in my head. Other concern about this, it's again about money. Yeah, budget. I don't know the knowledge about classification, all of you, but can you imagine to do a classification process on wheelchair basketball, for example, in American team and also in an Ecuadorian or Brazilian team? Just the wheelchair will be a very different, because when you need to use the wheelchair, one, you have, I don't know, 5 kilos and another 20. So just push the wheelchair, say, I'm pushing, but I'm pushing my body plus 20 or my body plus 5. So it's very hard for the classifiers to try to find better balance the process when you don't have the same tools, the same equipment for all them. So it's a very hard position for classifiers to decide which class you are if you don't have the same pathway possibilities for all the athletes. Is even the same for blind athletes. So it's so expensive, so medical treatments or even medical exams. So how can I show if I don't have in my country? It's true. So classification for me, it's a little bit harder than anti-doping if you talk about low level of athletes.
Thank you, Juliana. Lena and Cornelia, is there anything to add on this? Go on, Lena, you were smiling there. So,
I mean, yeah, I totally agree that money is a big issue there, because also in our sport, for example, in my team, recently we didn't have any hand prostheses for our athletes. And as you can imagine, having a hand prosthesis can make a big difference playing volleyball. So yeah, if we wouldn't get the donation, it would be impossible to play on the highest level. And I can imagine that some more developed countries with more budget going to sport don't have same issues as we do. So this is definitely one of the problems also in parasport. Yeah, I agree.
Maybe just to add, from a prevention side, I think it is very important, because we saw it, Respect P saw that classification is an integrity issue that's very important for them, even mentioned before doping. And there is a lot of pro voices in the community already to just consider the entire issues as integrity, and then we would not have to make the differentiation anymore. If we talk about integrity, I think integrity is a very important issue for all active athletes, and doping belongs to it, classification cheating belongs to it. But then we do not have to make the differentiation if one is more important to the athletes than the other. But and also in terms of education measures and prevention measures, we should maybe just take the broader focus on sports integrity instead of just focusing on doping or just focusing on misconduct on classification.
it raises a really interesting point, that, Cornelia. Do you think there will be a shift from anti-doping and clean sport to integrity? And then
I think that already happens. I mean, it's not starting now. I think I've seen that in many talks with colleagues from the also research community, that already happens. And you can also see it in the sports federations. There are so many integrity units now already that have not been there before. And doping is one issue that they tackle, but not only doping, it's also, for example, techno-doping in cycling. And I don't even can call it techno-doping. It is misconduct, it is fraud, it is sexual harassment, it's everything. And I think the shift is already in progress.
So if that shift's happening in terms of the integrity bodies that are now cropping up, sort of how do you think that could work in terms of classification? Because currently the IPC sort of hold the reins in terms of classification, but do you think there could be an avenue where it could belong to an integrity body?
Was that to me or to all?
Firing out to the whole group,
Okay, good.
really. Who wants to touch that?
I think that it needs to be carefully handled, but I think that it could be spread wider. The appeal element of it in terms of appeals for results, or and I suppose what's striking, and I have this issue with anti-doping as well, is I'm not sure how many integrity issues relating to classification are actually flagged every year, and what the consequence of that is. It's a similar way to anti-doping, like bans happening, people being 2 years into a ban before anyone realizes they haven't shown up for the last 2 years. I wonder why, and then they're back a year later, and people are wondering why. Similarly, I think it needs to be up front and center. Like, we sign up to a code, we sign up. When you're classified, you sign up to not misrepresenting. If you're found, no, okay, if someone's on a borderline and it's a judgment call, that's one thing. But we're talking about situations where there's gross misrepresentation. They should be known. And I'm sorry, but their coaches, their support personnel, they need to be dragged into it as well, because a coach is sitting there and it has either told someone to misrepresent, or is seeing, well, yesterday Pat was doing this 10% or 15% better. He should be doing what he does in normal training days. So I think there does need to be some sort of global visibility of what happens when things are caught. So we don't catch people that often. They do need to be visible when they are.
Yeah, it's what also I find really interesting is now really sort of reading back the transcripts from focus groups in terms of how much people want to speak about classification, but the issues in terms of reporting. So if they've seen an incidence of what they believe to be misrepresentation, athletes really didn't feel confident in knowing either whether there was a process to report, who to, or if there would be repercussion. Do you feel like, I suppose to the whole panel again, there's a potential for an integrity body or the IPC looking at classification and seeing potentially the WADA an anti-doping whistleblowing process being appropriate in this manner, or should it be handled differently?
I think, and also linking to Patrick, that all goes kind of hand in hand. Like, if we have this shift from anti-doping or clean sport to integrity, then we might also achieve a shift in moving from clean sport to, I can't think of a better word, but true honest sport that covers all integrity issues, not only taking substances or what is on the prohibited list or what is on the anti-doping rule violations, but everything. And if that happens, then that's in there. Like, it doesn't really matter if we have 1 or 2 or 3 flagged in that year, but it will develop a culture that athletes feel safe in the environment, that the sports federation, that WADA, that the IOC, that everyone really has an eye on honest sport. And I don't want to call it clean sport.
I agree. The integrity is a big subject, and we can have so many themes inside, but we start to treat all of them the same way, it's going to lose the reason. I cannot say to IOC what's a misrepresentation for a blind athlete. They are going to say, it's not our subject, it's now our goal. So I think maybe we can split this in each department. It's my idea. We need to have a special professionals work on this, a big knowledge of them, but a special professionals work on this. If you think boosting is not where is boosting and what a list? It's not right down there.
Speaking to Ali recently, I imagine. But absolutely, yeah. And it was one of the conversation points was, where do these integrities issues lie? Do they lie with the IPC? Do they lie with WADA? Who's responsible for this? Or is it a separate integrity body? I suppose thinking about these solutions in terms of what can be done with the issues that are raised, you've already touched upon professionalism, some of the issues in terms of the voluntary capacity of the classifiers. So Lena, you mentioned right at the start that the focus groups that you ran, they struggled to come up with solutions. Was there anything that was mentioned there that you thought, actually, this is that either really interested you as an opportunity to find solutions here, or was it really the feeling that there isn't any solution?
I mean, as I said, in a focus group, we didn't really find the solution, but I think that, for example, Para-Volley Europe did quite a good job there. Since there's a problem that teams are often very small in a way, they don't have enough players. So if you lose some of the players that are, because in sitting volleyball you have only two groups, VS2 and VS1. So, and we also have big problems with classifications. I cannot even imagine how it is if you have 10 groups. So yeah, in Para-Volley they decided that for some of the competitions, also international, also non-disabled can join to play on the international field. And so if the teams don't have enough players and are in a way kind of forced to do misrepresentation, they can participate in these kind of competitions, and it's I think quite a fair decision. So they can be on that not very high level competitions, but still they can be part of parasport.
Thank you, Lena. It touches on Patrick's point around in terms of classification being different by a sport, and the complexities in terms of sitting volleyball compared to canoeing, and beyond. But I'm conscious of time, and I want to give a little bit of time for questions from the sort of the wider audience. So we'll probably go for another few more minutes. And we've already got people asking questions already, so I'll leave those to the end. Unless, one sec. No, so let's go with the question there from Ashkat. So regarding the intentional representation issue, what steps should the IPC and international federations undertake in order to increase fairness of the classification system? So we've touched upon a few of these things already in terms of integrity bodies, but
maybe from I'm not a practitioner here, but it aligns with the question that I wanted to ask Lena and also Patrick, and that goes in that direction. Have you ever been included in the rules how to classify? Because that might be a solution that IPC and the federations could do to make it more transparent, also for the athletes, to have an athlete's voice in the making of the rules how to classify athletes. Has that happened?
I can kind of answer that, yes and no. So paracanoe is a relatively new sport, and the classification system changed during my career, and I was part of a series of athletes that were tested to see whether the new metrics would work and whether we would end up where they thought we would end up. So I didn't feed into it, but I suppose I did provide data. It's in terms of what the IPC and IFs should undertake. I think one of the things that has to happen is we have to have an open discussion. The classifiers have to be prepared to tell us where the line is between, in my case, KL3, KL2, KL1, and realize that once we define those, we define them at the start and it's kind of broad, but every year, because we classify more people, where that line actually is becomes more and more defined. And the athletes need to know where that line is currently and need to know that that line isn't slipping. It may be, it may be being more refined because someone closer to the line came in this year, and so this is now where the line is. But we need to know where the line is. The problem is, me as an athlete, only classification I will ever see is my own. And I'm the only person I will ever understand exactly how they reached that reason. And it comes back as well in terms of, can you complain about somebody else's classification? It's quite difficult because there's a sensitivity around it. There are visible disabilities. Mine is I'm an above knee amputee, but there are also, you could have an above knee amputee who has, you know, neurological damage on their other leg. That isn't particularly obvious, but means they don't have power or less power. And me asking a question about that person doesn't come across really well, you know? So I think if we at least had a definition of, without identifying the individual athletes, but saying, look, these are, you know, 3 examples very close to the line of KL3, and these are 3 examples very close to the line as KL2. It would be really helpful for athletes to be able to see, okay, that kind of makes sense.
Do you think athletes have I suppose speaking to Lena and Patrick again, in terms of not just rules and in classification, but in terms of education, is there a position for athletes in terms of speaking to younger athletes in terms of their own classification, speaking from your experiences?
We have in Brazil the biggest school games in the world, more than 1,000 athletes. So can you imagine classification day for all of this? It's yeah, it's a challenge. And always we have like an eligible athlete, and it's so hard to explain them that you're not blind enough or you're not disabled enough. And this is always have. We have at least 2% of these athletes coming around Brazil with an eligible perspective. And so it's very important to us to have a really strong education about classification, because we can discuss with the coach not to bring this athlete unless we are 100% sure this athlete is eligible to come. But about Brazil, because I'm from Brazil, we don't have this on a university or even in special courses, a part of Paralympic specialization or post-graduation. So education is 100% necessary, necessary to not the athletes just, but the entourage, and especially for the coach that is in charge of not just education, but be the family of this kid. So it's very important. Teach our coach before teach our athletes. It's my perspective, sorry.
Yeah, I also agree that education would make a big difference. Or to give some good examples, as Patrick mentioned, for example, in sitting volleyball, as I mentioned before, we only have 2 groups. So one is disabled and one is minimally disabled. And disabled, in fact, means, as Patrick also said, that it's visible. If you, for example, don't have one leg or one hand. But for those with minimal disability, it's very often not visible. So it can be multiple sclerosis or something like that, and you cannot know. So giving us, for example, a list of possibilities would, I think, make a difference. Yeah, so that we would know what is a possible disability of that athletes, because now no one knows for some of them, and yeah, it's a good point, I think.
I suppose a question I want to ask more generally in terms of the involvement of athletes in this research and athlete researchers. I suppose this is to everyone really, in terms of the athletes, in terms of what direction would they like this to go in, but also to Juliana and Cornelia, in terms of where do you think the research might take this sort of approach in terms of having athletes and speaking, involving the community in this sort of research?
I think, as I said before, I I think it's a very interesting road to see if we can involve athletes in the classification topic. That would be, I think, interesting to see also from a research perspective. And then we have planned a future project where we want to involve sanctioned athletes to give them a voice, talk about their stories, talk about what happened, and especially talk about the support they receive after it happened. Because normally right now it seems like once it happens, they're just let down from the system, but they're still human beings that I think deserve some support and respect too, still, especially those that committed unintentional anti-doping rule violations. But still, I think that is a very important target group that has not been involved in any kind of research yet. So this is something that we aim to do in the future now.
Thanks, Cornelia. Juliana, anything you would like to add to that?
Evaluation is always necessary. We evaluate, create a plan, re-evaluation to make sure if your plan it's effective or not. So it's really important for us, and academic or not, to understand that we are building the best plan for the athletes, and hear from them is the best solution. Because, for example, we are creating an app for blinds, but I'm not blind, so I'm not pretty sure if it works for them. So I need to stay with them, like sit beside me, and let's use this app with me. And I can have his point of view, his side of if it is technology or any other project, it's working for them, not for us that it's sight view or able body. We are not there, the athletes. Lena knows better than and Patrick knows that. And never one person that is not a Paralympic can understand 100% how it's be a Paralympic athlete. We try our best, but it's not the same. We need them. We need to hear from them.
I would really think that there is a place for researching involving the classifiers themselves, but also maybe a data project where you get an assessment from individual sports as to, and I'm not talking about it at low level classification, because that will then you end up with a lot of ineligibles where people are coming on at school age and whatever. But when you get to international classification, how many in your sport, how many people initially were presented at a different level coming from their national classification versus what they were ultimately classified as? So like, see if there's a transfer between what's happening at a national and an international level within individual sport, because that gives you an indication as to how clear the rules are and whether there's a clear kind of break between the classifications. I think it would be useful to see that. And also, you know, a breakdown, being frank, a breakdown by country and by sport as to the number of people who are being presented as at the wrong classification. Because I think that would be a useful piece of information to have. You know, is there something happening in individual sport where one country continually presents somebody at one level and they're always classified? Now, you know, you're going to present every athlete at the most advantageous classification for them, and that's fine. There isn't, I don't have a problem with that. But if it's always the case, then all they're doing is trying to game the system. And I think there's research that could be usefully done there to compare across sports and countries.
Thank you for that. Conscious of time, I suppose the last question I had, we could probably talk for quite a lot longer on this, yeah, to sort of start to wrap things up, I suppose we've already touched upon some of the solutions, but I suppose money, no object. What is the one thing you'd like to see changed or potentially implemented to protect integrity in sport? Be it anti-doping, be it classification.
Education.
Aligning to that, Juliana, I think education and improving the resources to do so in terms of educating the educators, because a lot of people and organizations try to do a good job, and I don't want to blame them because they just do not have the resources, but it also needs trained trainers to do a good job in educating and creating a culture of integrity, I think.
My version is it doesn't cost anything, which is the good news, but it's very difficult to achieve, which is the bad news. The whole thing is a moral question. The whole thing is an ethical question. And it starts with parents. It starts with the first coach that a person ever comes across. And are they prepared to say, if someone's playing soccer, yeah, you're okay to give them an elbow in the back or in the ribs, or, you know, give them a shove over or whatever? Or are they saying, no, that's not okay. I'm pulling it to the side. You're not following the rules. So in some ways it's free in the sense of we should be doing it already. But in another way, I think the only way that we get all of the issues, and like, I know we haven't concentrated on anti-doping, but it is a critical issue because, and boosting is similar. This does damage to people. This does damage to their health. And that's why we're regulating it. It's not just an issue about fairness in sport. The reason it's picked out is because it hurts people and it damages people and people die as a result of it. So we need to take a step back, and the step back is right to the very start of sport, the very start of life, in terms of what is moral and what is ethical. And trying to get that across is a really, really challenging, and I'm not that sure there's a global body that can do it, but that is what has to happen.
We need to be around for another few more hours to touch on boosting, TUEs, back on anti-doping. But unfortunately, we're going to have to go to Lena for the last word in terms of what would you like to see changed or implemented?
I mean, yes, I agree that education is a big deal here. So I think that in Slovenia, our NADO is doing a good job because they are working with kids mostly, and but there's a difference between para-athletes and athletes, and we are mostly working with athletes and not para-athletes. So I think educating also para-athletes, it's very important, and it would make a difference. Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely. Thank you all for your time. It's been an absolute privilege. I'm sure you have so much more that you would like to share. And I just wondered if there's any questions from the audience that we can quickly take before our time runs out. Any burning questions to ask our panel today? If not, there is one in the chat, which is, thanks for your ideas. Could you give an advice on how to improve detection of intentional misrepresentation, and that on also from an athlete's perspective? A challenging one, I appreciate.
I think one of the things that has to happen is a constant review, and particularly at international level. We need an equivalent of VAR, you know, and so that it needs to be something that occasionally somebody looks at your performance at an international level and goes, hold on a minute, how does this compare to the video that was taken during that person's classification? And if it doesn't match up, then drag them back in and look at them again. And I know in canoeing, they do it occasionally at the start while they're confirming a classification. But I think it's something that should be done on an ongoing basis and revisit people.
It was one of the suggestions that came up in the focus groups in terms of the whereabouts for classification. So in and out of competition classification, continuous process, obviously that doesn't work for all disabilities and all classifications. It's probably not needed, but in certain respects, just having that continuous career classification as a potential avenue to explore. Any more questions from the audience? In that case, I just want to thank you all again. It's an absolute pleasure. So yeah, thank you very much to our panel.